There's something wonderfully strange about Italian horror. These films exist in a world where logic isn't an absolute necessity, blood comes in shades of tempera paint red, and the sound design is less about synchronization and more about sonic chaos. Italian horror doesn't want to make sense, it wants to make you feel. For many American viewers, this is where the trouble starts. The typical Italian horror movie looks like it was dubbed through a dream, edited by a man in the middle of a fever, and scored by a synthesizer having a nervous breakdown. It is a cinema of sensation more than explanation, which can be jarring if you grew up on tidy 3-act structures and test-screened endings. Part of this disconnect comes from how Italian genre cinema evolved. In Italy, horror and thriller filmmaking grew out of pulpy crime novels, the gialli, named for their yellow covers, which trained audiences to expect outrageous twists, operatic violence, and heightened style rather than grounded realism. The goal was not to replicate everyday life. It was to rip through it like a straight razor across silk. Italian horror spans decades and subgenres, everything from the noir-tinged gialli of the 60s and 70s to the apocalyptic gorefests of the 80s, and even into modern experimental riffs on the old masters' works. Directors like Mario Bava, Dario Argento, and Lucio Fulci turned low budgets and wild style into a recognizable cinematic personality, often shooting fast, dubbing later, and tailoring their films for international markets hungry for something more extreme. These movies weren't built to compete with Hollywood, they were built to haunt it. They took familiar elements, slashers, zombies, haunted houses, and cranked the atmosphere and violence until it all felt like a hallucination you somehow bought a ticket for. Once you let go of the need for airtight logic, you discover a world that's as atmospheric as it is anarchic, a beautifully deranged cousin to the American horror tradition. So, if you've never dipped your toes into Italian horror, or maybe you're just curious where to start, this list is your initiation. From stylish slashers to zombie showdowns, here are 5 perfect gateway films, plus one delirious bonus pick to get you hooked on the madness. Let's start with what might be the most fun Italian horror film ever made, Lamberto Bava's Demons. When I was a young horror geek, I was all about the American slasher movies, but I also read Fangoria and Gorezone and a bunch of other magazines that would talk about guys like Argento and Fulci, and so I was very interested in exploring Italian horror. Eventually, I managed to find a video store with a copy of Suspiria, so I rented it and sat down expecting great things, and then turned it off 90 minutes later, sort of confused by what I had just seen. I loved the goblin score and the gore, but the narrative? It was so weird to a kid raised on Michael Myers and Jason. This experience didn't put me off of Italian horror, but it did leave me wondering what the allure was exactly. Sometime later, I'd be perusing the horror section at one of the mom-and-pop video stores, and I came across a box for a movie called Demons. Lamberto Bava definitely sounded Italian, but I couldn't resist the box art with the Sergio Stivoletti monster on the cover. I rented it, and it changed my life. Imagine, if you will, a midnight movie where a group of strangers get trapped in a haunted movie theater while demonic possessions spread like popcorn butter. That's Demons. The plot can be boiled down to people go to a mysterious screening, then someone gets scratched, and all hell breaks loose, and no one can escape the building. Lamberto Bava, the son of the legendary Mario Bava, directed Demons with help from producer Dario Argento, and you can feel that lineage all over this thing. The film practically vibrates with kinetic energy. It's loud, colorful, gory, and proudly ridiculous. The meta setup feels way ahead of its time. The movie within the movie starts infecting the audience, turning cinema itself into a transmission device for evil. What makes Demons such a great starting point is that it bridges cultures. The gore and the creature effects are crowd-pleasing in that 80s American horror way, but the atmosphere, lighting, and frantic pacing scream Italian excess. The use of heavy metal tracks alongside Claudio Simonetti's apocalyptic synth score creates a sensory bludgeon of neon doom that feels like someone projected a music video straight into your subconscious. The film is also a perfect crash course in how Italian horror treats logic. A character finds a katana and a motorcycle inside a movie theater, and no one asks why. It's just the world now. You don't interrogate it, you ride the bike through a swarm of demons while metal blares on the soundtrack. You cannot argue with scenes like a guy on a motorbike chopping through monsters like a human Cuisinart set to puree. For newcomers, Demons is ideal because it's paced like an American crowd pleaser, but it's still drenched in that distinctly Italian attitude. Style first, coherence second, and subtlety never. Once I saw it, I totally got what the Italians were doing, and it made me appreciate Suspiria and the rest of these films a whole lot more. Hell, Suspiria is one of my all-time favorite films, and I have Demons to thank for that. If I had a friend who wanted to get into Italian horror, this would be the film I'd tell him to start with. And if you're hooked on that one, Demons 2 basically reruns the whole concept just inside an apartment building, like an unhinged remix for the home video era. But maybe you're looking for something a little more traditional, something like zombies. You can't talk about Italian horror without talking about Lucio Fulci. Zombie, also known as Zombie 2, is one of his crown jewels, and arguably his most famous cinematic gut muncher. Officially, it was sold in Italy as a follow-up to George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, which had been retitled Zombie there, but spiritually, it's off doing its own grim, moldy thing. Zombie opens with an eerie set piece in New York Harbor, where an abandoned boat drifts in with a rotten surprise on board, immediately linking Fulci's island nightmare to the modern world. From there, the film heads to a cursed Caribbean island where the dead refuse to stay buried, blending voodoo-inflected folklore with gut-wrenching body horror. The narrative is simple, but Fulci's direction turns it into a sweaty, sunstruck fever dream. Even if you've never seen this one before, and you're probably familiar with its most infamous sequence, the shark versus zombie fight. A scene so insane you have to see it to believe it. A stunt performer in full zombie makeup actually wrestles a live shark underwater. Sure, the shark is drugged to the gills, but it's everything we love about Italian horror in a nutshell. Ambitious, dangerous, and absolutely uninterested in your sense of plausibility. But beyond the spectacle, Zombie is steeped in atmosphere. Fulci lingers on maggot-filled skulls, ruined colonial buildings, and slow, shuffling corpses that feel less like monsters and more like an inevitable force of decay. The film carries a sense of terminal apocalypse, as if the world has already ended and the characters are just now getting the memo. The slow, pounding score and long takes give it a funereal rhythm that sets it apart from faster, quippier American zombie films. For newcomers, Zombie offers both camp appeal and genuine artistry. It's gory and outrageous enough to satisfy fans of Romero, but it also hints at the bleak, almost cosmic cruelty that defines Fulci's best work. If you finish this one wanting more, then you're ready for his stranger, nastier nightmares like the Gates of Hell trilogy. If you're more of a slasher fanatic, this next pick has you covered. If you grew up loving masked killers dishing out violent death, then Stage Fright is definitely a film that should be on your Italian horror viewing list. Directed by Michele Soavi, who learned under Dario Argento and worked with both Lamberto Bava and Joe D'Amato, this slasher is a love letter to Italian style and American structure. The premise could come straight from any 80s VHS shelf. A troupe of theater performers rehearsing a musical about a serial killer gets locked inside their theater with a real serial killer, who conveniently steals a creepy owl mask. It's an almost comically on-the-nose setup, but Soavi isn't interested in irony alone. He uses this simple scenario as an excuse to turn the entire theater into a surreal murder maze. Stage Fright is absolutely soaked in atmosphere. The lighting is razor sharp, bathing sets in bold blues and reds, and Soavi peppers the film with carefully composed shots that feel almost painterly. The killer, stomping around in that giant owl head, becomes one of the genre's most strangely iconic figures, simultaneously absurd and terrifying, like a children's mascot possessed by satanic energy. What makes Stage Fright such a perfect entry point for American audiences is its hybrid DNA. You get the straightforward rhythm of a slasher, characters picked off one by one, the creative kills, and a final stretch of cat and mouse, filtered through Italy's love of operatic visuals and elaborate set pieces. One of the film's most memorable images involves bodies arranged like a grotesque tableau on stage while feathers drift through the air, turning carnage into performance art. There's also a sly self-awareness running under everything. The characters are literally rehearsing a trashy exploitation play, then find themselves living through something even trashier and more exploitative. It's horror eating its own tail, and Soavi leans into that with a sense of dark humor that feels extremely modern. Alright, we're going to stick with that slasher energy for our next pick. It's impossible to go through an Italian horror primer without mentioning Dario Argento, and Tenebrae is the perfect entry point for new viewers. It sits at a fascinating crossroads in Argento's career, blending his earlier murder mystery instincts with the rising slasher trend of the early 1980s. The film follows an American crime author who's in Rome to promote his latest book. While there, he finds a series of killings mimicking the murders in his novel. On the surface, it's a twisty whodunit, but Argento uses it to poke at obsessions with violence, censorship, and the relationship between creator and audience. Characters in the film argue about whether violent art inspires real violence, even as they move deeper into a film full of exquisitely staged murders. Argento has always been fascinated by the connection between art and brutality, how composition, color, and movement can make even the ugliest acts disturbingly beautiful. In Tenebrae, that obsession hits a kind of cold, sleek perfection. The film trades the Baroque supernatural excess of Suspiria for bright modernist locations and blinding white interiors, making the blood stand out like graffiti on a blank page. And then there's the music. After working separately for a while, Argento reteamed with the members of Goblin, who delivered one of the most propulsive synth rock scores in horror history. It's punchy, rhythmic, and weirdly catchy. Music that makes you want to dance and lock your doors at the same time, basically. That sound would become synonymous with the 80s Italian horror, influencing how fans remember the era just as much as the visuals did. Tenebrae is also one of Argento's more coherent narratives, which makes it ideal for newcomers who may find his dreamier films like Suspiria and Inferno too abstract. But don't worry, there are still the wild camera movements, including a famous crane shot gliding up the front of a building, and enough stylistic flexing to show exactly why Argento is considered the king of Italian horror. For this next entry, we're going to go a little further back, and slightly more gothic. Before Argento and Fulci painted the screen red, there was Mario Bava, the grand architect of Italian horror style. Black Sabbath is a perfect entry point into his world, and a key stepping stone in the evolution from gothic chillers to more graphic genre fare. This anthology film, hosted by the legendary Boris Karloff, delivers 3 stories: a tense telephone stalker tale, a morbid story of betrayal and a corpse that won't stay put, and the unforgettable supernatural segment, The Verdelok, with Karloff as a patriarch who may have returned home as a vampiric creature. Each story taps into a different flavor of dread, from psychological fear to folklore horror. Bava's background as a cinematographer is on full display here. He uses bold color filters, expressive shadows, and carefully layered compositions to squeeze maximum mood out of relatively modest sets. The result is a film that feels both theatrical and rich, like a ghost story collection illuminated by stained glass. Long before color horror became the norm, Bava was experimenting with it like a painter, defining a visual grammar that later directors would riff on. Black Sabbath is also a great gateway film because it feels timeless. You don't need to understand Italian politics, genre history, or 80s trends to enjoy it. It's pure distilled horror storytelling delivered in bite-sized chunks. At the same time, it helps connect the dots. You can trace a line from Bava's shadow-soaked frames to the stylized murders of the Giallo boom and the garish lighting of films like Demons. Even filmmakers like Martin Scorsese have cited Bava's influence when talking about the power of color and composition in genre cinema. Alright, so there are 5 great starting points. But what's a list without a bonus pick? If you're ready to dive deeper and see just how crazy and sleazy the Italians could get, you're going to want to check out our final entry. Every great genre needs its resident maniac, and that's where Andrea Bianchi's Burial Ground, The Nights of Terror, stumbles in like a zombie after a 3-day bender.
It's incredible. Incredible.
Calling this film sleazy doesn't quite do it justice. This is one of those movies where you keep thinking, surely it won't go there, and then it sprints there like a starving man at a buffet. On paper, it looks like just another zombie flick. An eccentric professor meddles with ancient ruins and accidentally wakes up a horde of ravenous corpses.
Stand back! I'm your friend!
Then a house full of guests show up and are left under siege. It sounds familiar, but the execution feels like a bootleg Fulci film that got progressively stranger every time the script was photocopied. Plot threads appear, then vanish. Characters make decisions that would embarrass a houseplant. The zombies move like brittle puppets and look like they crawled out of a dustier, mustier graveyard than normal. And then there's Peter Bark.
Mother, this cloth smells of death.
Cast as a child, despite very clearly not being one, Bark's character gives the film its most infamous scenes, turning an already uncomfortably horny movie into a full-blown Oedipal panic attack. It's wrong in so many ways that it loops back around to unforgettable. Horror fans love to talk about "you've got to see it to believe it" movies, and Burial Ground is almost the textbook definition of that phrase. This is not the first Italian horror movie you show your parents to justify your new obsession. It is, however, the perfect bonus pick for viewers who have watched the more polished classics and want to see just how far the scene could go when taste and restraint were left back in the crypt. It's cult magic, part train wreck, part masterpiece, and entirely unforgettable. Italian horror isn't just a genre, it's a cinematic dialect, one that speaks in color, sound, and rhythm instead of traditional logic. Once you tune your brain to that frequency, it becomes addictive. The flaws that once felt alien, the dubbed dialogue, the jagged plotting, and the outrageous style start to feel like signatures instead of mistakes. These films were not made to please studios or test screening audiences. Many of them were rushed productions, stitched together for international markets, but guided by filmmakers who understood that horror works best when it's personal, strange, and just a little bit out of control. To watch Italian horror is to surrender to sensation, to let cinema infect you demon style until you start to see the beauty in the grotesque and the poetry in the splatter. So, if you've only ever experienced American horror, think of this list as a passport. Start with Demons for its raw energy, Zombie for its apocalyptic dread, Stage Fright for its stylized slashing, Tenebrae for its sharp modernist brutality, or Black Sabbath for gothic foundations. Then, if you dare, finish with Burial Ground for that final plunge into glorious Italian depravity. Because, truthfully, once you fall into this world, there's no turning back. And honestly, after you've seen a zombie fight a shark and a killer in an owl mask strut through a fog-filled theater, why would you want to? These films are magic in the best way. Now it's your turn. What was your gateway film into the world of spaghetti splatter? What would you show to a friend new to the subgenre first? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.
Smash everything!